Hello and welcome to today's podcast, where we're going to have our first discussion about a book. And we're joined by Dr. Branislav Hock, who has written a book, Extraterritoriality and Bribery. And I've read the book. It's a very interesting book and provides a lot of insights on bribery and how to deal with it internationally. And we're going to go into that in a bit more depth. But before we start discussing it, Branislav, I wonder if you could just introduce yourself to the audience and tell them a bit about yourself and your research interests.
Thank you, Mark, for inviting me to this show. I am a senior lecturer in economic crime at the University of Portsmouth, and I'm doing a lot of research on international bribery and corruption. I came through a transition from a doctrinal lawyer in Czech Republic, where I graduated in law, to an interdisciplinary scholar that is interested in economic crime, economics, law and economics, and criminology. So I came then through a PhD program at Tilburg Law and Economics Center in the Netherlands, where I spent 6 years. And for the last 3 years, I've been working as a lecturer in Portsmouth.
Okay, thank you. Now, most people's knowledge of extraterritoriality will be of the FIFA case, where obviously the Americans were able to do what most other countries have failed to do and start to tackle corruption in FIFA. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about this and show to the audience the kind of very wide-reaching impacts of extraterritoriality in relation to bribery and corruption.
Yeah, FIFA is a really special case. It goes beyond the pure internationally anti-bribery regulation, as it features a really wide reach of U.S. legislation based on so-called RICO standard, Racketeering Corrupt Organization Act, which allows United States enforcement authorities to sanction economic crimes, including bribery, corruption, money laundering, in other countries. But it's not only that it allows them to sanction conduct in other countries, but it allows them to sanction foreign entities and individuals. So what they work with in a FIFA case, especially what happened, if I stick to that FIFA example, they construct such a concept of a criminal enterprise. So they said that FIFA officials and corporations and different intermediaries constructed or worked as a criminal enterprise, as a mafia, de facto, as a mafia organization. And then, if only one element of that criminal enterprise takes place or is in the United States, US authorities has jurisdiction over the entire criminal enterprise. And that's special. It's not common, let's say, in the classic international anti-bribery law that usually focuses on corporations. But the FIFA case shows really that even many non-US individuals can be prosecuted and sanctioned in the United States.
Now that's very interesting. What kinds of things does an entity or individual have to do to fall within the ambit of American legislation?
So if I stick to, I change the direction towards international bribery cases, let's say these classic cases like Airbus, Siemens, Rolls-Royce, usually what we see there are two main ways how US enforcement authorities are sanctioning non-US corporations. First, you need to be listed in New York Stock Exchange. This is very important because if you are, you have an obligation to keep accurate books and records, and as well as you need to have effective or appropriate, to be more precise, internal compliance measures. And if you fail to do so, or any of your foreign subsidiaries or agents, you will be sanctioned in the United States. Not so often for violation of international anti-bribery charges and anti-bribery provisions of the American legislation, in this case, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but more often by its second, it's in fact first part, which are books and records and internal controls provisions. So these are these relatively, we can say, less controversial cases. These are not really so much cases of extraterritoriality, but then what you need to do, you need to act in the territory of the US, and this comes to kind of interpretation of territorial jurisdiction, and this is usually interpreted very, very widely historically. So some say even what it means. It means you use US banking system. You pay in US dollars, for example, and then if you pay in US dollars, money are at some point coming through correspondent accounts in the United States, therefore US jurisdiction. You can send an email that goes through servers hosted in the United States, therefore US jurisdiction. There is in the practice often a popular argument that this is the only jurisdictional criterion, and and it seems like, wow, this is just really, really crazy. In some cases, it is indeed controversial, but often this is not the only jurisdictional hook they have. These are usually really, really big cases. And last thing I want to say here is, in the third trick, let's say, is use of conspiracy charges. So if there is a presence of a US business, for example, in a joint venture, that one company is under US jurisdiction because it's, for example, US domestic corporation, such as Halliburton, for example, in the Bonny Island case, and its business partners in the joint venture are Japanese, French, and Dutch corporations, for example, then the other business partners might find themselves as well under US jurisdiction. We can complicate the matter more and more, and so we can as well speak about the existence of, because most of these cases are resolved out of the court, so some classic jurisdictional or criminal law principles might not apply. And what I saw and what I discussed in that book, so I analyzed most of these cases, all of the cases above $30 million in settlements. There is what I call jurisdiction by consent. So sometimes US authorities over some part of that big scheme actually don't have jurisdiction, but the corporation just agree to include it in some, as part of some bigger resolution, because they just don't want to quarrel with, they just want to resolve out of court, and maybe this is just a relatively small piece out of which is part of a much bigger problem.
So that's very interesting. And so clearly organizations, they need to be aware of this, even if they think they are not operating in the US, using US dollars. There are many other ways where it seems that they could be dragged into this. So clearly, organizations need to be conducting themselves in an appropriate way and pursuing appropriate preventative strategies against bribery and corruption.
Indeed, this is indeed true. I think one, even if there is not that immediate incentive of being investigated and prosecuted in the United States, I think corporations, if we still look at it from perspective of US enforcement, for example, UK corporations still need to be aware of the fact that it's a matter of their reputation, and the way, if they comply with the US standard, it allows them to do business with corporations that actually have to directly apply with that standards. Because the trick is, if they would do business with partners that are not compliant with that standard, they could get prosecuted because of their business partners for lack of adequate internal compliance procedures, for example. So it's as well, there is a clear business case in recognizing that U.S. anti-bribery standard.
Okay, and the other incentive, of course, is the quite significant monetary sanctions some of these companies have faced. So perhaps you could just talk a bit about that, Branislav.
Yes, so far we have been discussing U.S. enforcement. However, what I discuss in the book, and that's why the second part is called a collective action perspective, is that historically, if you allow me to speak a little bit about history and then how we end up in sanctioning corporations hundreds of $1,000,000 and potentially billions of pounds, if you look at cases like Airbus, for example, or Rolls-Royce. We thought it's a quite new thing. We have first laws foreign corrupt practice tech in 1977 following the Watergate scandal. But really, some huge enforcement, we didn't see any huge enforcement actions until, let's say, 2007, 2008, when we saw Siemens scandal, which was a really groundbreaking settlement. But before that, we didn't really see enforcement. At some point, US started really engaging with large enforcement actions, especially against European-based corporations in UK, in France, in the Netherlands, for example. And according to the theory, such a hegemonic action at some point leads to more collective action, and if you speak to some of these who are negotiating these settlements, you see they will be commenting Europeans really didn't like it. They didn't like that Alstom is, for example, getting $850 million settlement, and this money are being paid to the US Treasury. Similarly, British Aerospace or BAE Systems paying hundreds of $1,000,000 to US Treasury, and it's a really political but as well practical problem. So what it led to is what I called in the book Americanization of European anti-bribery laws, when American system, by many various reasons, has proved to be just more effective and allowed enforcement authorities to sanction these corporations, as well for political reasons, but as well because of legal instruments that they had to sanction them hundreds of $1,000,000. And in, I would say, really recent years, let's say 3, 4, 5 years, we see a huge increase, a huge change in legal laws of European, but as well, for example, Brazil and other countries, and an increase in their enforcement. Usually, countries that experienced US enforcement action ultimately increase their own enforcement. And this is the new thing, and it really complicates the enforcement landscape, which came from, criminalization of this conduct, which was not, international bribes were tax deductible until late 1990s in many countries, such as Germany. It was openly supported by governments. It was a legitimate business expense, we could call it. And it came to such a huge offense, which Europeans are currently investigating and prosecuting. And what we see in these new cases and why these sanctions are so high is, of course, we can say, are they high really? Because we don't know how big crimes these corporations were doing in these years. But these settlements usually cover, I would say these are so-called corrective settlements or exemplary settlements, because they cover potentially 20, 25 years of criminal activity of these corporations or questionable activity. So if you look at Rolls-Royce, these schemes that are mentioned in the settlement documents goes back to 1989. So it's decades of different managements that were changing. So that's why they are so high. Why they are so high as well, because more than one country participate in an enforcement. We see increasingly that, and for example, Airbus shows that in our recent settlement with French, UK, and American enforcement authorities that collaborate, and together sanction corporation in a so-called global settlement. So from non-action through hegemonic action, extraterritorial hegemonic action of US enforcement authorities, we are now in a new landscape that includes overlapping enforcement actions of multiple enforcement authorities over actions of multinational entities.
That's very interesting, Branislav. Now, I want to kind of take you on to one of the criticisms of this. Some people have argued this is a new form of imperialism, and that you're actually defending American imperialism. What do you have to say about that?
Well, that's quite a good question. Yes, I have faced these criticisms because the book presents a collective action perspective, and it explains that move from no regulation to kind of like collective or quite significant enforcement in many countries. And well, I was really first why I use that model. I was thinking like, oh, okay, so well, there is some corruption and somebody's fighting corruption, which might be good because these corporations cannot bribe as they used to. But at the same time, that hegemon US is not doing it necessarily because they are just good, they are altruistic. They do it because probably they have some self-interest in doing so. And there are all these criticisms of moral imperialism that one hegemon is imposing is cultural, legal, and other norms to other countries that need to comply with them in changing what might be a cultural issue in some way. It's against the rule of law. It's against some democratic principles that you are intervening. It might undermine international relations. So there are all these reasons why we should criticize extraterritoriality as a political legal phenomenon. And indeed, there has been that discussion in the end of 1990s about it, whether we should have these kind of conventions such as OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, later on United Nations Convention Against Corruption, that allow or suggest this kind of wide interpretation of jurisdiction, whether we should have them at the first place. So it's indeed a huge moral discussion whether this is the right thing to do. And the criticism of my book comes with the fact that what I'm saying is that I'm not going to now for a moment deal with these principal questions. I acknowledge that these exist. Despite all that criticism of extraterritoriality, is it at least effective? And of course, then you need to define effectiveness. What kind of objectives are there, and whether that enforcement allows us to reach these objectives. So that criticism comes. I defend extraterritoriality to an extent that I say more countries are engaged in what could be considered collective action, because it leads not only to broadening the scope of jurisdiction, therefore imposing additional constraints to corrupt businesses to bribe foreign government officials. So that's why it's effective in the first place, which is kind of obvious that if you would be only sanctioning US businesses, and if you would be allowed to sanction as a only US business, probably you would not have any enforcement, because that trick was that you are allowed to sanction competitors. It leads to some incentives others to increase their regulatory activity as well. Therefore, we have a regime that creates constraints to certain undesirable behavior. So from this perspective, it's effective. Whether it's good, ultimately good, I'm not saying whether it's ultimately good. I'm saying in this discussion, if I'm supposed to be normative, this is one element you should take into account. There simply were no constraints, and now a significant amount of important countries are taking proactively steps to sanction and investigate bad businesses.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Branislav. What would you recommend to individuals and organizations working in this area? Does your book discuss some of the things that they should be thinking about, what they should be doing?
Yeah, so the last chapters deal with suggestions and policy reform. And there are a number of, if I would mention few, first of all, we should acknowledge that that the global corporate crime, and looking at the global corporate crime and underlying laws and regulations, it might be a bit we might be a bit limited if we do not acknowledge that a law in that context functions a bit differently than classical national criminal law, for example. We should acknowledge and see how the power changes like regulatory and legal institutions, for example, in United Kingdom. If I would be looking at these processes from a legal doctrine perspective, I would end up by saying it's uncertain, there is not the rule of law, and therefore it's wrong. But if you look at it from the collective action perspective, you see what's happened behind the scenes. So the book offers you analysis from a very specific perspective of how these extraterritorial processes function, and these should be taken into account by corporations that want to effectively prevent and comply, prevent bribery and comply with foreign anti-bribery laws. It includes what happens during settlements, when it's settlements negotiations, what would trigger jurisdiction, in which countries, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, the main focus of these policy recommendations lay in let's say public sphere, in the sphere of enforcement and how enforcement should work and how countries should think about the future. There are quite important people that suggest establishment of certain international anti-corruption courts, for example, and dreaming about having international anti-corruption courts or court or other body that would potentially prosecute and investigate corruption-related crimes or navigate enforcement authorities in order to be more effective, for example. So that book shows different governance alternatives to the current regime, which is based on national enforcement led by United States, then internationalized by some international treaties that are, however, quite soft in the way how to push countries to be more active in enforcement or how to resolve some huge enforcement conflict that can come in the future. Is that myth, secondly, what small countries should do? Because this has been really discussion about big countries that have that power to charge, to sanction these big businesses. So I'm providing suggestion to small countries that can be part of that enforcement network that support bigger countries and are being more and more involved in some elements of these huge corruption schemes. I call it bundles that include really conduct in sometimes 120 countries, and each of these countries may have some legitimate interest in investigating and prosecuting part of that scheme. So I'm suggesting things around involvement of the small countries. And at the same time that at the international level, engagement of small countries in a bigger enforcement should be acknowledged and should be recognized. Many of these monitoring mechanisms, such as the OECD, look only at the enforcement initiated by the particular country and they score some points. But what I think some small country like Czech Republic or Slovakia, they might really struggle to buy their own enforce and sanction certain huge businesses, but they probably should be incentivized to help UK, France, or United States with some part of the scheme, as some other countries are doing. For example, Hewitt Packard and Polish part of that is a good example.
Okay, Branislav, thanks very much for that. Now, your book has a discount. Perhaps if we could end this vodcast by you pointing viewers to where they can get hold of this book, and also at a discounted price.
So there is some modest discount that can be found. The link to that can be found on the description below the video. And I would suggest either Amazon is an easy way, or go to the publisher, which we will put the link there, to Routledge. So I really enjoy working with Routledge, and it was they provided me good support in publishing the book.
Thank you very much, Branislav, and thank you to viewers for watching this podcast.